Not alcohol person. I don't like alcohol. I don't like working with drunk people. I don't like the smell, the sour smell of drunk sweat. Ugh, it like turns my stomach. And I recognize like that's my own internal bias, and like I'm in the minority when it comes to that. But I spent a couple of years working for Insomniac that does Electric Daisy Carnival and all these really big like 80,000 person raves. And that's a whole bunch of like drunk 20-year-olds who are also on MDMA, and it just smells like sour vomit. Like I would never go to Mardi Gras. Like I know it's not for me. And so we all have a little bit of stigma and bias, especially when it comes to substance use. And so maybe we pause the video and we can go around and be like, does anybody else have any substances that you have bias around? What it means to be altered and what it means to be able to give consent from a place of not being altered. And what I've found is, the things I would have consented to in my 20s in a non-altered state are probably not the things that I would consent to now in my 40s in a non-altered state. And so I also think that, being able to make good decisions and well-informed decisions all plays a role in, altered by our childhood trauma and altered by, for me, divorce. Like, I had a good friend who's been divorced twice now, who's like, the first year after your divorce, you like get a pass for making terrible decisions. Like, right? You get to date the one person that you probably never would have dated, because you're like, it's a pendulum swing, right? And so sometimes you swing too far one way to figure out where the ball is going to land in the middle. But in altered states practice, it's like how and why we like to get high. What tools do we use to utilize? What tools do we utilize to alter our consciousness? I am also a caffeine and nicotine user, and they provide us with minor changes in altered states. This is your Mind on Plants, Michael Pollan? Yes? Right? I found the caffeine section to be probably the most interesting section. The fact that we can correlate the use of caffeine in human history with the development of the second hand on a clock, right? We used to not care, and then all of a sudden, caffeine, there was a whole prohibition of coffee and tea in Europe in the 1600s, because the safest thing to drink before we had good, clean water filtration was to drink wine and mead and things that were fermented, because the fermentation would take out the parasites. And so what if all of a sudden everybody's drinking wine all day long because it's the safest thing to drink, and then somebody drinks some coffee and they're talking faster and moving faster, and it was like almost like what we see with meth use, and people are like, coffee makes people crazy, we should ban it. And so what are the tools that we individually utilize to alter our consciousness or to bring us back into presence? How do we engage in these practices, whether intentional or unintentional, unconscious? And what I've learned of being a trauma therapist and a psychedelic altered states expert is, like, whether we're altered by substance or circumstance, like, everyone deserves dignity and respect and patience. And so whether it is your house burns down and wildfires are a thing. I have multiple friends that lost homes in the Santa Cruz fire 2 years ago, and what it's like when you become altered by trauma. So altered states, substance use altered states, psychedelic use altered states, brought on by trauma, substance use and trauma-induced altered states kind of look the same. in your brain, look the same in your behavior, look the same in your cognitive processing ability. And so what we can do is we can use the knowledge from trauma-informed research communities to utilize those same tools to assist during psychedelic crisis and integration. Has anybody seen the window of tolerance diagram before? Dan Siegal? This is fabulous. It was in 1999. He created this lovely infograph that I have then reappropriated into prettier colors. And we all like staying in that lovely yellow comfort zone where we are cool, calm, collected, and connected. And we're able to self-soothe, and we're able to engage in dialogue, memorable dialogue, and emotionally regulate ourselves. And what we find with dysregulation, whether that is by taking substances or trauma or being exposed to especially if you work in like death doula spaces, right? You're dealing with not only end of life care, but you're dealing with the friends and the family and their grief process and what it is to hold space for somebody's grief process in itself is traumatizing. We see this in our medical community, especially in our ICU nurses post-COVID. Almost everybody is burned out and experiencing vicarious trauma. I have a couple of friends who, were traveling nurses during COVID, and were like, people go into healthcare because they want to help people and they want to save lives. And what does it mean if you just spent the past 2 years hauling dead bodies because you couldn't do anything about it? And how does that affect the moral injury that we now have? What is it like to live on a dying planet? What is it like? There is a fabulous podcast which should be added to the resource list called The Emerald. And it is Joshua Michael Schrei. I think that's his last name. He does an amazing podcast that is currents and trends through a mythic lens. And he goes through ancient myth and ancient story and pre-Christian polytheism and festival and ritual. And when we engage in festivals, right, what were ancient festivals like? They were mass community gatherings where we would get together and drum and fast and grieve and be connected, and there's time dilation and altered states, especially in fasting and sweat lodges. And there's a couple of episodes, one being Trauma and the Vegetation Gods, which is about the relationship of plants and being in relationship with plants and how we process trauma. We find that people who garden are about 30% more likely to not experience depression. And that's because if you are growing plants, if you grow food, right? If you grow, tomatoes are the easiest, and so we'll talk about tomatoes. But you have to, how long does it take for a plant to produce fruit, right? And what is our expectation on ourselves to be efficient in that way? It's sometimes I'm I'm not doing enough work. I haven't responded to all these emails, and my plant is I haven't even grown a tomato yet. What are you, right? And so being in relationship with plants, especially in the age of technology and the internet, slows us down because we can compare ourselves to their growth process. And I'm always so happy when there's new leaves and new little plants with fruits coming in, but also the importance of pruning and the importance of grieving. Tomatoes are a single season crop. And so at the end of the season, the thing that has provided us with sustenance, we have to kill and grieve. Well, it will die, but what is it like to have this thing that you've spent all of this time and energy growing that you have a reciprocal relationship with, and then it ends? And we have to go through our own grieving process. So people who have a relationship with plants process trauma better than people who don't. But there's a great episode that he does, which is entitled, I wish it could have been a different way, or I wish it could have been another way. And I can't get through it without crying, so be prepared. I started listening to it while I was driving and had to turn it off, because, but he has a son, and the whole exploration is, what is it like to raise a child on a dying planet? What is it like knowing that we have no control and that we are not leaving it better, we are leaving it worse for the next generation? And being able to to process the existential dread that comes with climate change, that comes with gun violence, that comes with, how do I send my kids to school if I'm afraid their school is going to get shut up? Because that is a very common experience here. And so there's a ton of reasons why we become dysregulated. We get in a fight, we get disciplined at work, we fail an exam, we go through a breakup, we lose a parent, we lose a child. And all of those things send us into two different directions, which is also your trauma response of fight or flight, or freeze or flop, or fawn, which is the fifth one. But hyper arousal is your heart rate increases, your breathing gets more shallow, you are unable to focus your attention, your brain is moving faster than your body, you have anxiety or anger, you have impulsivity or rigid thinking. And hyper aroused states are kind of like the amphetamines, right? Also MDMA, also LSD. They do the same thing. They increase your blood pressure, they increase your body temperature, you process at a faster speed than where you are at your baseline. Or you go hypo aroused, and that is your parasympathetic nervous system that's causing you to freeze or to flop, or to have you ever had really hard conversations with somebody and they start falling asleep? And that is flat affect. You lose your emotional regulation. You become flat, you become tired, you stop eating, you are sleeping 15 hours a day, or staying in bed for 15 hours a day. And these are the GHB, ketamine, things that bring you down. Right? And so when you're working with people in altered states, especially in crisis altered states, you can be like, oh, this person is hyper aroused right now. It's really hard to contain them. They're they don't want to sit still. They're antsy, they're anxious. Or you get the people who are sedated or sleeping, or unable to rouse or walk or talk or understand verbal commands. I do a lot with first responder training with law enforcement and security staff at music festivals, to be if people are in extreme altered states and you say, hey, stop, they might think that you're talking gibberish. They're not being non-compliant. They are just in such an altered state that they're not able to process the verbal commands that you're giving them. So instead of saying, you're now being non-compliant and resisting and we're going to physically assault you, why don't we wait a few minutes, or wait a few 30 seconds and ask them again?
I'd like to ask you about the realistic situations of a person having a hangover, not just from one day of drinking or something, but sort of a hangover to life in general. Or the burned out kind of person. After COVID, people were getting burned out. Mm-hmm. Those kind of practical situations.
Yeah, and so the ways to regrow your comfort zone are engaging in mindfulness, engaging in helping people identify their own capacity, and sometimes people's capacity, I use video game analogies, we'll get into that in a second, but like, you know, if your life meter is in the red, like you need to go find a medicine pack because you're burned out. And burnout recovery isn't like I'm gonna take a weekend off and like go to a meditation retreat and unplug. Like burnout recovery takes about the same length of time it takes you to get burned out, which oftentimes is 6 months to 2 years once you start getting the really severe symptoms. And so we also process not just verbally, but somatically. And so gentle stretching, taking walks around the block, engaging in art practice, like artistic expression. I like sand tray with adults as like a method of like, let's like create a scene together, and like, why did you put this here? And like, what does this mean? Why are these two dinosaurs together and all of the humans over here? Do they not commingle in your reality? And like, what can we interpret from nonverbal expressions? Spending time in nature, being able to like reconnect, watching sunsets, watching sunrises, but letting people take a break. And in America, people are not allowed to take breaks. I have 2 friends that live in Sweden, and in Sweden, they have 5 weeks of mandatory paid vacation. Like if you don't take 5 weeks off from work, like you basically get dinged on your taxes. You have to prove that you did not work for a solid 5 weeks throughout the year in Sweden to like get tax breaks. And so it's like the exact opposite of American society, which is like, how soon can you be back at work? It's like, we need to create systems where people can take breaks, where people can take the time to recover. And a lot of that is, we're so fear-based because we're so, we struggle so much with economic insecurity in this country and healthcare insecurity in this country that if you take 5 weeks off of work, you're going to lose your benefits, and so we can't do that. And so part of it is a systemic issue, but like art, music, time in nature, rest, like genuine rest, and I think it's a challenge that we have to be able to give that to our community members. And so we'll see this again. This is, psychoactive substances that may induce hyper-aroused states: meth, cocaine, LSD, psilocybin, ADHD meds, steroids, and then hypo, alcohol, benzos, GHB, cannabis, opiates, ketamine, other pharmaceuticals. And so when we're looking at people who are for working with our community members who are using drugs, we can use the same kind of model of how do we help you reground? How do we help you get back? How do we help you grow the comfort zone? Because when you're in stressful environments, if you're a burned out nurse, right, and all you're doing is bouncing between the two, and the comfort zone shrinks, and all of a sudden you're seeing that every day you're becoming dysregulated instead of maybe once a week or once a month during a stressful event. And so once we recognize that our comfort zone is so small that we can't even fit into it anymore, we have to work to expand it. And we find that through meditation, through mindfulness, through somatic movement. I think dancing is a really great practice. I go to ecstatic dance. I'm sure there's ecstatic dance here in Colorado. For those of you who are sober, who don't like going out late at night, a 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. community sober ecstatic dance where you get to feel the vibration of the bass of the speakers, you get to be in community and move your body and stretch your body around, really starts to like crack things open. And I find in Southern California there's a festival called Bhakti Fest, which is like a yoga festival. That has a lot of chanting and movement practices and everything else, and you will go to Bhakti Fest and it'll be like 2 a.m. and you'll hear somebody at the campsite just like sobbing because they've cracked open this like somatic stuff that's been stuck inside of them, and it's allowing for the emotional release. And I have a sticker on my water bottle that says, normalize crying in public.
Yes.
One of the most common questions I get is it okay for me to cry here? And I'm like, yeah, you can cry anywhere. I want it. I love it when I'm walking through the grocery store and there's somebody crying in the grocery store. I'm like, yes, right? Because we restrict ourselves so much that it starts spilling out in other ways. And so being a good psychedelic citizen is also having your community members, or your nesties, which is what I like to call them in bird analogies, is to be like, it's okay for you to come to my home and cry. Like, it's okay. I had a friend of mine who had a really rough combo ceremony, and she was feeling like, ugh, like a little bit like depressed and like flat about it. And she was like, can I come by? And I was like, yeah. And she like came by and she was like, can I have a coloring book? And I was like, yes, you can have a coloring book. And we like threw on like a really good, a good set of music, played it on the speakers of the house. And we just sat around and colored. And like, doing art with your friends in community, in nature if you can. If you do it outside, in community, have it be a nonverbal processing, like you're hitting a lot of the things and creating community for that, whether it's through Aspen Psychedelic Resource Center or however you define your communities, whether it's your ayahuasca church or getting together. For us, it's about how do we welcome in our community? How do we show up for our friends in community and give them the permission to not be okay, right? And give them permission to be like, it's okay to cry here. It's okay to scream into the void here. Favorite thing about Burning Man. Big wide open spaces. You can just scream into the void as loud as you want. Nobody's gonna bother you about it. Like if you're in a city, people might call law enforcement if you hear like, primal screaming. But you guys are in the Rockies. Go out to a mountaintop and just, I like, I'm not a huge like amusement park person. It's like a little too capitalist for me. But man, roller coasters, it's like the place where you can scream until you like have no more air in your lungs, and it's okay to do that. But it's very rare to find other places where it's okay to do that. But the primal scream on like a good drop on a roller coaster like helps reset my system. And so I live like 20 minutes from Magic Mountain, from like Six Flags, and so like once or twice a year I'll be like, I gotta go scream, and I'll just go ride roller coasters for a day. But for like that works for me. That might not work for any of you. I do a lot of art in my recovery when I was burned out. I found art to be really helpful. I made this tie-dye that I'm wearing right here. This is like what I made this. I make tie-dye. I have a whole tie-dye workshop at my house. And people will come, and we do community open. We do workshops there, and people can come and bring. We also are, zero waste burners, and so it's like bring something that has a stain on it, and like refresh the clothes that you already have. Like, what do you have that's white? All of the linen napkins at my house are all tie-dyed in different colors because I just like needed to like do small motor function things and like cover it in color. And like there's tie-dye is a wonderful therapeutic process because there's a lack of control, right? You tie something up into a ball and then you put color on it and you have no idea how it's going to turn out. You like hope it's going to turn out great. Maybe it'll always turn out in some beautiful pattern, maybe not the way you expected. But then you put the color on it, and I see when people come for workshops that they get like really anxious. They're like, I don't know. Like my mom came and did it, which was really fun for me. And she was like, well, like how much do I have to put on it? And I was like, well, however much tie-dye you want to put on it. And she was like, I don't want to put too much on it. And I was like, but there's no such thing as too much. You could just, like, you could literally dump it in a thing of dye if you wanted to. And she would, like, put little dots of things on it because she, like, had all of the control issues come up with, like, I don't want it to get too intense. And then she was, like, disappointed because it didn't, like, the color didn't saturate all the way through. And I was like, well, you like, that's, like, the lesson, right? Like, am I showing up and trying to do the bare minimum, or like the little amount, or am I going overboard and all of a sudden, like, the lines that I wanted on it aren't there anymore? And so it, like, allows you to find these processes, and then you have to wait because, like, the dye has to sit usually for about 6 hours. And so we do it as like a camp out. You come in, you do tie dye, have a camp out, and then in the morning when we're all drinking coffee, we all do all, like, the tie-dye reveals, and there would be, like, oohs and ahs, and then, like, you get, like, a really good reveals of people being surprised and, like, proud of the art they created. And it's really like a sharing show and tell, which I really, like, appreciate about it. But it brings up, like, the lack of control, the patience aspect of it, the, like, unexpected outcome aspect of it, and it teaches you lessons about yourself as you go through it. And so I really think that it's a valuable practice is to find some sort of visual art form. And there are people who are like, I'm gonna get into welding, or I'm gonna get into, like, creating stained glass, or, like, cool, different, making jewelry that you can gift to people. I love handmade gifts. I'm a big fan of being able to, like, make things for my friends instead of buy things for my friends. And like, what does that mean? How I'm showing up in community? If I'm taking the time and intention to make something specifically for you, and, like, what does that do for my friends feeling like they're being seen and valued? What we know about humans is, like, our core need is to belong to a group, because that hits all of our safety stuff. Because if you are alone in the world, you don't have the protection, right? Pre-industrial revolution, it was like, you have to be in, you can't do it all by yourself. You can't grow all of your own food and protect your crops and everything else. You need to be in a community that one person is doing the cooking and one person is doing the harvesting, and people are raising children, and people are protecting the village and staying up all night to, like, be a guard for the community. And so being part of a community and feeling like what you're offering to the community is being seen and valued. And without those two things, like, you can't, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, gets thrown out. You can't actually meet any of your needs until you get those two things that are related. COVID taught us how isolated we have become. And, like, online communities are valuable, but not as valuable of being physically conspiring with people, right? Conspire to breathe with. That's why breath work and chanting is also such a powerful practice when we're in community. A note about psychosis. There is a risk of psychosis, psychedelic-induced psychosis, and HPPD, which is hallucinogenic persistent perception disorder, which is when people have long-term perceptual side effects to psychedelic use. Whether that is delusional states of thinking that you're God, or thinking that you have special magical powers, or you can predict the next song on the radio, or any of those things. And also having visual distortion or sleep distortion. In 5-MeO-DMT communities, there's about a 25 to 30% what they now refer to as reactivation, which used to be called flashbacks. That lasts for up to 7 days post-experience in 30% of the population. And so if you, being aware that, like, this is something that might keep me in an altered state for a longer period than I expected. There is about, I just found this out from Rick, which is in about 20% of psychedelic users is the length of time of effectiveness of drug is actually like 2 to 3 times longer. And so if somebody's in a clinical trial and like the 8 hours is up, but they are still quite in the experience, like what does that mean for us as sitters? How long do we keep them? Like how do we release patients? How do we like say, okay, it's time for everybody to go, and there's like 3 or 4 people that are definitely not ready to go, and like how do we create safe containers for them? Also sleep deprivation, right? Psychedelics mess with our sleep patterns. Usually we're up all night and exhausted depending on when we're taking them. And so knowing the overlay between substance use, sleep deprivation, especially polypharm substance use, and people who have extreme trauma, people who have complex trauma that go in for healing, and maybe they're in the wrong environment. Like maybe they're in a recreational environment and all their trauma stuff comes up from their childhood, or are they at a 40-person ayahuasca ceremony and not working one-on-one with a facilitator? So part of it is helping ourselves and our community members make good choices about how we engage and where we engage in altered state practice. So here are some, not counting the window of tolerance, some additional substance-induced altered states. The involuntary shaking. Anybody seen that before? Oh yeah. Especially in the legs, the leg thing. Oh man.
Every time.
Really? Rocking, right? Rocking is also self-soothing to our somatic system. It like puts us in balance with like being able to feel the vibrations in our bodies. We're all vibes, right? We're all like this mystical thing that's being held together by atoms is actually like a vibration, like a conscious vibration that materializes in everything. Also a note about sexual energy. Sometimes people become very hypersexual on psychedelics and want to be able to have some sort of sexual release as well, whether that's voluntary or involuntary. There was and I don't mean to laugh about this, and it hasn't come up in years. When I was working Zendo at LIB once, there was an individual who, a male presenting individual who really did not want to stop touching himself. And it was becoming a safety concern of like friction and things like that. And it's like, well, I guess we just have to like swaddle them down and put their hands on their sides because we don't want them to hurt themselves, but also they were impulsively touching themselves. And it wasn't like anything was coming out or anything getting stimulated, but it was like this impulsive energy. And like, how do we keep people safe in a non-judgmental, non-shaming way? And it was like a blanket swaddle. Like you swaddle a baby and you just like, you have to keep their arms down because they don't know what they're doing, right? They are so altered that they are unaware of how they are physically harming themselves. Also, when it comes to women with sexual trauma and hypersexualization when they take substances and things like that, and knowing that they are altered to the point where they are not going to, they can't consent to any sort of sexual contact, and how do we keep that person safe, you know, when there's the hypersexualized, naked 22-year-old beautiful woman running around Burning Man at a sound camp at 3 in the morning offering to have sex with people. Like, how do we keep that person safe? One of the calls that we're making for clinical spaces around psychedelic therapy, and this is going to be like a HIPAA compliant data storage thing, is videotaping sessions. In the clinical trials, they're all videotaped, and those videos we hope are reviewed, with the exception of one horrible incident that happened.
That brings up a point. Are there drugs that people are taking, such as atypical antipsychotics, that sort of are warning signs that you better be careful with these people?
Oh, yeah.
Or a person taking lithium because of bipolar?
Yeah, I mean, every year at Burning Man, we get at least 2 people who are like, I stopped taking my SSRIs because I wanted the drugs to work. And now, and it's like, oh man. And so we have to get them like back on their medication. But lithium is a huge risk, and there are rule outs for SSRIs and for certain antidepressants and other medication. Lithium being, if you are bipolar and taking lithium, psychedelic practice is probably not a good choice for you, and the makeup of your brain, and working with the disappointment, especially now, because the new lease on life ketamine thing is, you get a lot of people who want to engage in ketamine assisted psychotherapy, and they think it's going to like quick fix them, and it's not that. And then you work with disappointment, and how do we address the disappointment and the expectation?
Also, with like multiple personality, well, it's not called multiple personality disorder anymore, but
DID.
Along those lines, DID, we've had ketamine patients that didn't know that they had that, and then during the ketamine session,
It also
their
comes out.
DIDs come out. So just being cautious of those kind of dissociative disorders too.
Yeah. And so personality disorder rule out, like SSRI, bipolar rule outs, especially in clinical trials. But what we're seeing is, especially in this new decrimmed world, that people are going to do what people are going to do, and even if they get rejected from being on a clinical trial or participating in clinical structured psychedelic assisted work, they're going to find it on the street and take it anyway. And so how do we educate our emergency room providers around risks, especially in Colorado? You guys are number 2 after Oregon. Oregon's, but totally different landscapes in legality. And so utilizing things like TRIPSIT, the TRIPSIT drug interaction chart, which is very helpful, which lists all the psychoactive substances, and it's like, I want to take this one with this one, and it's either red, yellow, or green. Like, green's okay to mix these 2, red's never mix these things, and yellow is like, be aware of it. But making sure that people, we're also finding with the plant medicine community, especially in ayahuasca communities, people becoming very anti-Western medicine. But we're also finding people who go and engage in plant medicine work and think that they are healed and stop taking their blood pressure medication or their diabetes medication, or are becoming really, non-compliant with medical oversight and medical. There's a big anti-vax component to ayahuasca communities. I was in Costa Rica post-COVID for an ayahuasca circle. We were sitting around talking about something, and they were all talking about like anti-vax things, and I try not to be judgmental around it. And I was like, oh, I'm vaccinated, and 3 people were like, are you okay? And I was like, because I'm vaccinated? Yeah, like I'm totally fine. But they were like, I can't believe you did that to yourself. I can't believe you would take an experimental drug, and like, it's like the opposite of being in public health, where there's a lot of stigma around being anti-vax. But like in plant medicine communities, there's a lot of stigma around being vaccinated and what that means. And the people who think that there's like the shedding thing that was coming up in plant medicine communities, where you're like shedding vaccinations so people wouldn't allow vaccinated people around their children. There's like a lot of like around delusion around like generalized facts, and then we end up getting flat earthers and other things that are, if the medical establishment lied to us about this, then they must be lying about everything. And like, how do we as psychedelic citizens be able to provide care guidelines around things that we all thought were universal truths, like gravity and like being on a spherical planet that we can travel around, like, because we know we can do that, but there are people out there that no longer believe that, and no longer believe that, you know, were you talking about fruitarians? No, Liza was last. Yeah.
But also, yes, like I've seen that too.
Right, where people are like the raw food, like fruitarians, the people who only eat fruit.
The only ethical thing to eat.
Huh?
The only ethical thing
The only ethical thing to eat, right, is bananas that were shipped here using fossil fuels. And so really being able to recognize that like everybody's in their own kind of siloed reality, and how do we come up with like community agreements? Like I would like to agree that like we are all on a spherical planet. Not everybody in the plant medicine and hippie communities agree with me on that. And so, right, just like we shouldn't abuse children, or we shouldn't, you know, there's like certain things that I would like to think like we all value life, that our gun policies are like our the gun crisis in America is ravaging communities, and making all of us have vicarious trauma around acts of violence in our community. I would like to think that we live in a non-violent society, which is not true. But substance abuse, altered states, we'll go back to this. Screaming, oh yeah.
I'd like to ask a question about something you brought up earlier about sexually aroused states coming up, and then how do we not shame that individual but also deal with that situation. And if you're going to talk about some language stuff maybe tomorrow or later today, please wait. But what are some ways, like, sexual feelings are normal, that's not reciprocated here? Like, what are some of the language that you've found to be successful in those scenarios?
I think having a really and it's two separate issues, right? There are two separate things to address. One would be in like a clinical therapeutic space, and you know, prior to going into an altered state, saying, you know, I will never cross this boundary with you. I will, you know, even if this comes up for you, like, and if it does come up for you around having kind of this like transference of feelings of like we get a lot of the like, you are my healer, you're my person, I'm in love with you, like I'll do anything for you, like type of thing, and really having that as an established boundary within a therapeutic container. I think that in recreational spaces and crisis spaces, like we don't have those established boundaries. And so it can get very confusing for people. There is a reason that we never work with an individual alone. We always work in teams. We always work, ideally we have enough gender identity balance in those spaces that if there is a woman who is becoming hyper, like sexual, having extreme sexual energy, that we match them with somebody who is of their same gender presentation, and like say, you know, I appreciate the compliment, like I'm here in a professional capacity, you know, this is, you know, I had somebody, and everybody thought it was hilarious. There was one girl at Desert Days last year who was doing we found her under a food truck. She was like curled up under a food truck, and my friend Zoe was like, hey, do you want to come with me? And she was like, yes. And she like came, and she was doing the thing where she's going around to everybody being like, you're so beautiful. You're like unbelievable, like, oh, wow, and like wanting to touch everybody's faces. And so it's like we'd have to like, you know, 5 minutes like keep rotating new people because it would like, so that it would restart and not continue to escalate. And so it was like my turn to tag in, and somebody turned around and she's like, giving me a lap dance. And I'm just like, and like, it's about it's like not isolating them unless there is, like the looky-loos, and we like need to take them into like a more private space. But really being able to like work on teams, say thank you so much, I appreciate the compliment, like, and it's okay for me to say no, or hey, like the way that you're talking to me is actually kind of making me a little bit uncomfortable, so redirect. What about this over here? What about this? Do you want to go for a walk with me? Do you want to changing setting is really important in psychedelic crisis. So having an eye mask, having ways to change sound. So earplugs, very beneficial, or over-ear noise canceling headphones, because people don't like things stuck in holes of their bodies when they're high. Blankets, extra clothes when people show up with no clothes. Also really helpful, wrapping people in blankets, but like working on teams, and then hopefully having community integration afterwards, of once they've returned to their baseline, being like, hey, I wanted to, are you open to having a conversation with me about what came up for you last night, and what I saw, and how I can reflect that, and can I provide you with resources around sexual trauma? And being able to, and sometimes we find ourselves in situations that we're not working on teams, and it just falls into our laps sometimes. I get a lot of phone calls. I get a lot of 3M phone calls from people freaking out, of like, oh God, help with the situation, and like, I'll send people like where are you? Can we get somebody to you? Can I call somebody who's in San Diego who can come over to your house and make sure that you're safe for 45 minutes? Because if you are all of a sudden, right, it's like the oxygen mask on an airplane. If you don't have your oxygen mask on, like you too are going to fall into that crisis hole, and now we're going to have two people we have to take care of instead of one person we're taking care of. And so how do we assemble quick emergency response teams and crisis teams? And when you're in a cohesive community, like hopefully there are people that you can call on, but there's also a consensual agreement of, if there is an emergency, do we call emergency response? Do we call your friends and family? Do you have resources available if we need to expand the space holding team?
I'd like to mention restraints, because that kind of topic comes up if you have a person screaming. I know in emergency rooms, from working as an emergency room physician in previous years, there are rules about restraints. If a person is in danger of injuring themselves or others, you can use physical restraints, but otherwise those are really regulated. So if you have a patient who's in a psychedelic state who's in danger of themselves or others, what you said, wrap them up in a blanket?
I mean, for the person who wouldn't stop touching his genitals, the best thing to do was to basically swaddle him.
So let's keep such restraints available, or be prepared.
Yeah, a lot of times when somebody's in that extreme of a state, that kind of goes above scope of practice, and we get medical professionals involved, and medical professionals have the ability to restrain people. Also, having worked on multidisciplinary crisis response teams, I find a lot of ER doctors and medical professionals use chemical restraint. Which would be a B52, which is a combination of Benadryl, Halidol, and some sort of alprazolam, injectable benzos.
Injectable Halidol is commonly used.
Right. So they basically chemically sedate people without using physical restraints. That is not always the best choice in the psychedelic processing. It is to cut it off by adding other medications to it. In Insomniac, with like the big raves that I used to work, high dose ketamine works as 300 milligrams injected will sedate somebody without affecting their respiratory system. But ketamine, Halidol, like chemical restraint, is often used in emergency medicine with psychotic patients and psychedelic crisis patients.
Wouldn't with physical restraint there be the risk of traumatizing
Yes.
somebody? So wouldn't you want to avoid that at all
Yeah, you want to.
times?
Yeah, that is a last minute thing, and I mean, this is Colorado, and you guys had the Elijah McCain thing, so you guys are less likely to use ketamine as a chemical restraint, especially along with physical restraint. I would be okay with physically restraining somebody with the risk of that trauma if they're like trying to jump off a building, right?
But short of that, like
Yeah.
short of some really imminent.
Yeah, if there's not imminent danger.
I also want to talk about that energetical difference between being swaddled, which is like a loving thing, as opposed to being handcuffed or being restrained, right?
Right, or being strapped to a
Or
bed.
having your arms behind your back, right? The swaddled with blankets can be done in a sense of love, where somebody who is really dysregulated, like, and I'm sure that the practitioners in these spaces, there's the attitude towards it, right? I'm curious if you've seen a difference with, and this I guess is something that needs to be taught to emergency responders. Psychedelic responders know how to respond to these situations with love and respect and autonomy and patience, versus a lot of first responders who are responding out of trauma, out of their own fear. Like, we as practitioners have had situations where we're in fear and we know how to not demonstrate that to the client.
Right. And so a lot of it is about like how you approach situations, how you identify yourself in situations. I don't have cop energy. Like, there are people out there that do have cop energy. You might have a little bit of cop energy in you. Everyone's like, with your like arms crossed, like, right? There's like a little bit of like, and it's okay. Like, I actually have a ranger who I work with at Burning Man who has big cop energy, and he always wears a baseball cap. And people would just not trust him because he just, like, that was his thing. And so he now has attached antennas to the top of his, like, little ball antennas to the top of his baseball hat, because it makes him have less of that energy. And like, and that's okay. Like, we all, right? Like, we're not for everybody, and we're gonna really kind of dive into like identity around how we identify in this space. But also, right, there's a difference between like a white man approaching the situation when it is a female person of color, like, and the inherent trust, or even just a white presenting person in going into BIPOC spaces, and the trust that you have to work around and establish when you are identified as somebody who is part of the system that caused the trauma and abuse for them, especially in the medical system, especially for women of color who we know have been extremely traumatized by Western medicine models. That, like, guess what? Going into a medical clinic to get psychedelic treatment is not the right space for them to engage in psychedelic healing. And so how do we create like safe spaces for people who don't think that the medical industry is a safe space for them, because in their trauma history that is true. And so how do we empower vulnerable populations and communities of color to be able to have their own healing process?
Can I just loop back to something that
Yes.
you said about the when you're dealing with somebody who's over-sexualized, to just be expected to respond to the same thing over. Don't expect them to hear it the first time that it's said.
And right, and the looping thing, especially verbal looping. Is that even on there? No. But verbal looping, like saying the same word over and over and over and over again. Wow. Oh, wow. And then it'll go on for like, 20, 30, 45 minutes, and then all of a sudden they'll add a word. And they'll be like, yes. We got one extra word in. And so now it's like, okay, like they're no longer in that loop and they're starting to come out of it. And so like, how do we, it's like, wow, mom, wow, great, there's an extra word in there, like, well done. And like, you can get it out a little bit. And so I'm screaming, laughing, chanting, involuntary vocalizations. We get that a lot in ayahuasca. Vocal changes. One of the things that I've seen, especially with like the DID stuff and extreme things, is all of a sudden your voice is no longer your voice. You're speaking in a lower cadence or a higher cadence. And so when I've interacted with people in crisis work, and I'm interacting with them, all of a sudden the next morning they're like, they have a totally different like vocal tone and cadence. And so that's always really interesting to me. Nonverbal states, people who go nonverbal, that's okay too. We had somebody in the Zendo at Burning Man one year, and this is like, I so appreciate people who do this, but walked into the Zendo and like handed us a piece of paper and went inside and sat down. Opened up the piece of paper and it said, hi, like my name's Sarah. I'm 22 years old from San Francisco. I took LSD. I took one hit of LSD at this time. I am on the autism spectrum and sometimes become nonverbal. I like art supplies. Great. Went into the corner, brought her some art supplies, just super happy, but like was nonverbal and knew that this is a thing that happens, right? And so when we talk about self-awareness, thank goodness. I also love the people at Burning Man that write all of their drugs and dose times in Sharpie on their arm. Also, I live here with their address, so you can return them to their home when they're done. I appreciate that type of stuff too. I think it's adorable. I'm like, thank you so much. It makes it so much easier for us instead of guessing, right, for hours. Emotions and feelings, bliss and ecstasy, godlike states, extreme grief, suicidal ideation, and there's a difference between I want to kill myself and I feel like I'm dying, and being able to differentiate between those two things. Where if somebody's in an extreme state going, I'm dying, that's not suicidal ideation. That is like, wow, that sounds, and also you're not dying is the thing that you're not supposed to say. You don't want to ever be be diametrically opposed. And so, wow, that sounds really challenging to feel like you're dying right now. Like, I just want to let you know, like, I'm here, I'm checking your pulse, and like I can see that you're breathing, and I can see that your heart is still beating. And so being with that feeling is okay, and I'm going to do my best to keep your physical form safe so that when you are no longer feeling like you are dying, you are still here with us, but not saying you're not dying, right? Because that.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt your conversation. So I think that my limited experiences with people in this space, there's a lot of them, especially first timers, who feel like they're actually having a medical crisis. You know, that like feel like they're dying, and it causes a panic attack, and it causes like this bad loop of like they're convinced they're having, they're like, take me to the hospital, and I have to go to the hospital. And like, what do you do in that space? Like, I feel like if you're the trip sitter, I mean, maybe this is not very common, but I've seen it. Is it better as a trip sitter to put your hand on their neck and like take their pulse and be like, you're okay, but like engage them with their feelings, or just let them ride it out? I mean, if someone is having a medical issue, if like, you know, they do need to go to the hospital, you need to recognize that. Or if you overindulge their sort of their situation, you could make it really difficult for them by like, you know, encouraging this feeling that they're actually like having a crisis.
I like it, you know, if people are engaged in intentional psychedelic practice, whether recreational, ceremonial, I always like having a medical provider on site. We don't have to take you to the hospital, there's a doctor right here. Do you want to get checked out? Okay. I also Like I always have a pulse oximeter on and a blood pressure cuff with me in harm reduction. I have an AED. I have a blood pressure cuff, temperature, pulse ox, to be like, I'm going to check your vitals right now. And if your vitals are concerning, then yeah, let's go get you to a doctor. Like, I'm concerned too. But if it's the feeling and you have somebody who is like, all right, well, you don't have a fever, your blood oxygen levels are fine, like, you know, your pulse is probably elevated because you're having anxiety, but like how elevated? What's your blood pressure? I had a friend of mine call me this week who ended up in the ER because they took ketamine and got like a really, really intense headache and was like, something's wrong, and put a blood pressure cuff on, and it was like 191 over 117, and so she called the friend and was like, I need to go to the ER, like, because my blood pressure's too high. And her pulse stayed like around 120 for 3 hours. And it was like, maybe you have a brain aneurysm. Like, these are the symptoms. Like, and so let's get you checked out to make sure. But prior to engaging in use, there should be some consent and conversation around, like, when do you want me to call emergency services? Or, especially in communities of color, we never call emergency services. Like, right? Because it's not going to help the situation. And so having that conversation with your group of tripping friends is really important. Of like, if we go on a hike, like into the woods for an hour while we're all on mushrooms, like, does somebody have a first aid kit? Like, what if somebody sprains their ankle and they can't walk? Like, it's very rare that it happens, but it does happen. And so talking about emergency situations and how we as a community are going to respond to that, I think, is a really vital conversation. And so sometimes it's like a, yes, we will take you to get checked out, or here is somebody, or we can call a friend who's a medical provider who can come with an EMT bag and like make sure that everything's okay. Usually if there's a lot of, like, if it's an intentional thing, we usually have a medical provider. It's actually when I go and work events, it's part of my contract is there has to be a medical provider on site, because I don't want any of the liability because I'm not a medical provider, and so I can't make that call. And so part of it is, and if nobody in your community is, it's a great opportunity for you to get to do like an EMT training and have somebody in your community be like, oh, I'll step up because I want that knowledge.
Yeah, does the Psychedelic Resource Center have like a number that you call that, like, if somebody's having something that's in the form of a medical situation that, you know, like, someone will come who's not, doesn't have, you know, any
So
slides on?
for psychedelic emergencies, there's the Fireside
Yeah, you
Project,
can go Fireside.
which is 6-2 Fireside, and
It's on the second.
they I don't know if they would help triage in that way, but they would be the person to call in the immediate. And we are working to train law enforcement, crisis counters, and first responders. We haven't gotten that set up yet, but at least in the next year it will happen. So we'll be able to have medical providers be aware of psychedelic emergencies and be able to provide help. I want to acknowledge, I mean, I was not a facilitator, but I held space in a psilocybin journey this past spring where there was a medical emergency that happened. In any given 8-hour period, there's always a chance that somebody's going to have a medical emergency. It's really important to have somebody on site. In the same way that if you're going out in the backcountry on a regular basis, take a woofer class, right?
Right.
This is what you should do. You should always know how to self-rescue, because you never know how far you are from that.
And I think with this being said, if we're going to be signing up for supporting people, then we should be very, very ready, if we don't have a doctor in our network, to take them to the hospital. The doctors aren't there to arrest you or call the cops. So
Good Samaritan laws
And
are strong.
I should also add, in Aspen, we are so lucky to be able to call law enforcement and know that we have law enforcement that isn't going to escalate a situation. Right? We are hoping to help them become even more psychedelically aware, but that's not the culture of the law enforcement here, which is
Just
a lesson.
as Aaron, a standard medical consent form that people sign to protect the person who's administering the psychedelic substance, because I can see, just like physicians can be sued,
Right.
psychedelic therapists can be sued, and then you get into insurance for that.
Right.
So, I mean, anyone
All of
who's-
those issues.
Yeah, anyone who's responsible for that space should have a liability waiver that says, you know, the person who's undergoing, I acknowledge these risks. That's the standard, you know, legal protection.
Right, yeah. And there's great psychedelic lawyers out there that have those in psychedelic churches and communities especially in Colorado, that will help you draft those documents if you choose to start hosting for your community.
And the National Psychedelic Association is developing liability insurance. They are currently fundraising for the feasibility report. If you know anybody who might be interested in investing in psychedelic liability insurance, we definitely are working on that product.
Cool.
It's to the National Psychedelic
National Psychedelic Association.
Yeah.
Association.
So in all of our grand psychedelic experience, who's ever encountered like aliens or entities in those spaces? Yeah, especially in ayahuasca. Like, there are some inexplicable things that happen with the DMT aliens that like to poke out of the jungle. And there's not a scientific explanation for it, and part of it is the like beautiful mystery of the fact that we don't have all the answers. But if you are going to be working in one-on-one spaces with people, there is a small but real chance that they or yourself will get possessed or have to interact with something from the spirit realm that is inexplicable, that might be malignant, and that might be benevolent. It is rare, but it does happen. And my friend Catherine McLean, who is a psychedelic researcher and who just put out an amazing book called Midnight Water, was working with somebody, and there was like a malignant spirit possession situation that came up that attached themselves to her, and she was really sick for like 6 months from it. And it is, you know, if you are wanting to work in this space and you're like, I'm gonna help people heal themselves and it's gonna be like beautiful roses and everything else, and then like a demonic spirit possesses itself and like fucks your life for a couple of weeks or months, like it's a real phenomena that we don't have scientific proof and no way to really talk about it. Ayahuasqueros and people who work in indigenous medicine spaces are quite aware of this, and it's part of the mystical experience that comes with working in psychedelic spaces. And so it does happen. People talk to the alien that's next to them, a little like bird that sits on my shoulder every once in a while. It just like pops out, like it's there. I can't explain it, but
I feel like this happened to me with ayahuasca, and I felt a bit gaslit because the ayahuasquero was telling me that it wasn't real and that everything that I was experiencing, it was my inner demons coming out, but I felt a very different way. So it was this thing where I was really confused because I felt like I was being lied to, and I felt like I was going crazy. So
yeah, I actually had somebody ask me a couple weeks ago who was like, oh, I went to this thing in Colombia, I did ayahuasca and combo and like some San Pedro, and like was really in this like, we do this one day, we do this the next day, do this the next day. And he was like, and now there's like a voice inside my head that wasn't there before that is still there 6 months later. And I'm like, am I crazy? Like I'm like, I don't think that you're crazy. I just like, have you talked to somebody who can maybe help you cord cut that? Or have you asked it what it wants? Like, why are you still hanging out with me? Is there something that you'd like me to do for you? Like, is there a mission that I need to go on? Is there a, like, how can I release you? Because you're in a space that you're not supposed to be.
Do you feel like it's okay though if the people serving the medicine have a very specific view on it? Or do you feel like it's okay they should be holding space for everything that
I
comes
think
up for
that
you?
they should be holding space for everything that comes up for you. And I know that like different lineages of different medicine servers like everyone has a different kind of belief system around it. And I think that like if there's being like, oh no, that's not real, like it's probably a red flag warning around that practitioner.
I just want to add that in our How to Choose a Facilitator talk, which is available on our website, psychedelic facilitators are people. They might know a lot, but they're not an authority, right? They're a knowledgeable person, they're not a person of authority, right? So it's a good person to get information from, but it's not the only source.
Right.
And know what you're signing up for. That talk really goes into this as well. Are you choosing to go to a medicine person that has a lineage and a belief system that doesn't align with yours? Or are you curious about that and open to it? Or are you looking for peer support or a therapist? Like really know what your
Right.
needs are before.
Yeah, and I think that's really beneficial. I mean, like the screen's on, but don't use this part. But like last time I was in, yeah.
Are you comfortable talking about like if you go into these situations where it's a crisis, or if you're just in a recreational setting, what kind of like circles you set or just measures you take to spiritually protect yourself?
Man, my favorite thing about festival psychedelic users is, right, because there are like amulets and protecting like elements and sage and Palo Santo and certain scents and all of these different things. But like festival goers are the best because they're like, hey man, like every time I trip I have to wear this giraffe hat now. Like it's like not like right, they're like festival magical items and not like this like amulet, but they're like, oh yeah, like this weird light up staff is like the thing that keeps me safe. Because like in the psychedelic space it's like there's like things that develop meaning for you that like are part of your kit that you like your trip kit. And that in itself is kind of, and so like in spiritual intentional medicine spaces they usually have like you know eagle feathers or certain crystals or you know a certain candle or something like that, but in like festival spaces it's like this one onesie that I have to wear every time, or like this like weird glowing unicorn that I have to carry. So they like have like crappy festival magical objects with them, which I think is always interesting. But people associate meaning, right? Transitional objects are a part of the therapeutic process. And so if this is the thing that, like if this piece of labradorite is the thing that like kept you grounded in reality as you ventured off into cosmic space, like that might be a thing that you want to bring with you every time. But also it's about like attachment to objects. And like, right, I had mala beads for many, many years, and they broke, and I had this like whole crisis of like, these are the things that that were part of my avatar, and like now they are gone, and it's like, well, it's just an object. Like, but we associate meaning with it, and so there are certain things. Saging, using sage as a tool for energy clearing. Utilizing, I have a really good like crystal dagger that I bring to ceremony with me, and it's like you never know when a weird entity is going to come around, and like sometimes you just like need the thing to be like, nope, like I'm not open. A lot of times like closing your energetic circuits, right? There's yoga mudras for your hands and fingers that close energy loops in different belief systems and lineages. And sometimes when I'm when people are in deep psychedelic process, sometimes just like instead of pushing it out and pulling it in, like closing the loops actually helps. And so learning what works for you, and everybody's a little bit different.
Well, that was like kind of what I was thinking about too, because it's like when you're in that altered state of consciousness, it's like, are you just more open to everything that's around you, like the veil? Because like,
Yep.
I wasn't high when this happened, or on drugs. So like, I went to a ghost tour at Cheeseman Park on Halloween, and like I had something attached to me for a couple weeks, and it was like very scary, and like no one.
And you're like, am I going crazy?
Yeah, but like I sensed it and I felt it with me everywhere, and it was scary and weird. So I understand that can happen when you're like, I guess like
When you're more open to it.
yes,
Right. And we know about psychedelics is they increase our suggestibility.
yeah,
And so, and they like open up certain channels in us that can receive. There's actually, and again, the ayahuasca community does a lot of this, but there's a lot of ayahuasca shamans out there that like leave energetic cookies on everybody who like sits with them. And T Fairy went to go sit with a medicine woman a couple of years ago and got into the space, and the medicine woman was like, oh, you like sat with this person and sat with this person and sat with, and it was like she would never know that, but she could see the like energetic marks in that space and like how to cut those cords off, the like energetic cords off. But in mystical, and some people are like, that's what I do, like because it increases my power as a as my like cosmic power as a facilitator, and they like will leave little cookies on people, and it's, you know, also that's part of their lineage, and and being non-judgmental and trying to be understanding, but not doing it in a non-consensual way is probably like a little bit sketchy. I want to move on because I don't want to like run out of time today. And we just kind of just did this, which is like, what has your experience been around altered states work?